going to start with telling you that in daily life, just like you, I measure time in seconds, minutes, and hours. But as a paleobotanist, I work with 100,000s of years, million years, or billion years. So today, I'm going to move back in time and visit with you worlds of a distant past with a kind of time machine. So I'm not going to be using a time machine like the DeLorean over here, like in Back of the Future. That would be really nice. But instead, I use the fossil remains of photosynthesizing bacteria and plants, like here there on the left. So this diagram on the right shows in a clockwise manner the most important things that happened in life on our planet. At the top right, you see the origin of the solar system and the Earth. And going from there, following that timeline, you see the appearance of the prokaryotes, the change from an atmosphere without oxygen to an atmosphere with oxygen, and the appearance of eukaryotes, animals eventually, and the colonization of land. And it's the colonization of land in the Paleozoic, up there at the top, that I would like to focus on in the end. But first I'm going to take you through those first steps. So this is a reconstruction of what Earth could have looked like about 3.6 billion years ago. There was no oxygen in the atmosphere, and our first evidence of life are these dome-like structures over there. They were produced by microorganisms like cyanobacteria. They lived in microbial mats in the shallow areas of the oceans. The fact that they're layered is a proof of that they were photosynthesizing and slowly moving up while sediment was trapped in those layers. This is not, however, evidence of oxygenic photosynthesis that we are used to from plants. So you see a formula in the back, and you can see that those organisms, like cyanobacteria, purple bacteria, a whole bunch of other ones, used carbon dioxide and a molecule that carried hydrogen to produce sugar and something else. Plants that use oxygenic photosynthesis use water for the hydrogen. These organisms weren't doing that. So now we go much further forward in time. We're now looking at a 2.4 billion year old landscape. And you can see some green things here in the front, and those might very well represent cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria are microorganisms that do use oxygenic photosynthesis. And I'm going to show you a formula again. You see CO2 with water together through the process of photosynthesis form sugar and oxygen. And with sugar, you can make all kinds of other organic compounds. So this is a really important formula because most life forms on our planet depend on this. Photosynthesizers like the ones that I described earlier and these ones that do oxygenic photosynthesis is what a lot of the food webs are based off. And heterotrophs, like us, eat plants, autotrophs, to stay alive and to get energy. So we go 200 million years further towards the past, and that is when we see our first eukaryotes. And eukaryotes are cells that have a nucleus with a membrane around it. Before that time, the organisms that we found in our oceans were two different groups, archaea and bacteria. So here is a diagram in which I very simplified show a archaebacteria or archaea and a eukaryote with the nucleus in it. So about 1.6 billion years ago, we see the first evidence for eukaryotes with chloroplasts. So here we are already going into the direction of what a plant cell looks like, because you need a chloroplast. That's where photosynthesis happened. So what happened is that during that time, via a process we call endosymbiosis, cyanobacteria moved in to a eukaryote and eventually turned into a chloroplast. This is 560 million years ago. I'm starting to feel more at home now because we're getting closer to the Paleozoic. And we see the first animals. Those marine animals you see at the bottom and on the left did not have eyes, well, definitely not a nose or mouths, but we definitely know that they're animals. And on the right, over there, you see some green fuzzy material, and that is probably some living green algae. Living green algae are important because that is the group where land plants came from, but we already include those in green plants. You see a fossil example as well, and you can see that they look a lot like the living one on the right. So far, all the life that have been described in all this time on our planet has lived in water. So you should imagine what the continents look like without plants on the continents. Let's quickly skip ahead. You could imagine something like this. This is not the Earth, it's actually Mars, and it's in the present, but there are also definitely no plants there. So if you look at how important plants were in the moment, in the time before they moved onto land, their contribution to the food webs wasn't that important because of a lot of other organisms like algae and cyanobacteria, also autotrophs that live in the water. Diatoms is also a good example. What makes plants really different is how they dominate the continents. So green plants, as I mentioned before, include the green algae and land plants. So here is a nice representation on them. On the left, you see an example of green algae, which is called Chara. And about 460 million years ago, we start to see the first evidence for plants on land. Those are not nice flat plant fossils, but they're actually little tiny fragments that show that they were already there. The first land plants looked like the liverworts. That's the second picture here on this figure. And they did not have roots, they did not have leaves, they were just flat pieces of tissue, green tissue, that were lying on the surface of the sediment. And you can see that's a living one, so yes, they are still around. From there, there's a whole variety of other plants that we see appearing in the fossil records, including lycopods, horsetails, ferns, seed plants like conifers, but there were many more in the past, and last, the flowering plants. So, what makes that change going from algae to something that looks like a liverwort possible? For that, I'm going to use a picture of my friend Hannah Bonner, a paleo-cartoonist. She says that there are 4 steps that you have to do. So if you ever picked up some algae from a little tiny pond somewhere and you brought it above water, you should have seen that it turns into a slimy mass because it doesn't have support to stay up straight above water. It would also dry up relatively fast because it's not protected through the air. So what you first need to do is to put a nice waxy layer around your plant tissue to prevent drying out. If you would look now at a plant now, almost any of them will have it, you will see a nice waxy layer on the leaves. And that is called a cuticle. If you zoom in on a cuticle, and behind me you can see it at the bottom left over there, you can see that in the cuticle there are little tiny holes that we call stomata. Stomata is what the plants use to breathe air in and out. So when it takes up CO2, water and oxygen get released. The third thing that you need is to protect your reproductive materials, so your spores, from drying out. That's again no problem underwater, but if you want to fly away through the air, you need to not dry out. And this is those spores with a sturdy wall are one of the first things that we find that's evidence for land plants. So I already told you that the first plants were relatively small, like the liverworts, probably not bigger than something like this. If you want to grow bigger than 10 centimeters, you need the correct plumbing to bring up water from the soil and spread nutrients to your tissues. You also would like to have roots to be more stable in the soil and also to bring up that water. So here we move the plant that we just made to an early landscape in the Silurian 430 million years ago, and that is where we see the first evidence for vascular plants, the plants with internal plumbing. So I'll remove the cartoony one so that you can actually see what I'm talking about. In between those rocks around the pond, you can see little tiny green fuzzy things. And these are in the back at the top, the remains of the Cooksonia, the earliest vascular land plants. Cooksonia did not have vascular system yet, so it had a vascular system, but it did not have roots yet. It didn't get very big. Each little stem you see at the top was about maximum 3 millimeters thick, so this thing was still relatively small. Now I'm going to move forward in time again. But first I'll show you what the local view could have been if you would have been in the Eurypterus and would have gone out of the pond to check out what's happening on land. So here we are in the early Devonian. The Devonian is the time period that comes after the Silurian. It's 400 million years ago, and it's getting greener on the landscape, and the plants are also getting bigger. The ones at the bottom left, over there, are about a meter high, so still shorter than I am, and I'm not very tall. And there was still a lot of space on the landscape where plants were not growing. They started to form roots, but they were not really independent completely of water, so they still lived close to water. And one of the plants here on the front could have very well be an Aglaophyton, and we have really nicely preserved material of these plants from Scotland. They're called the Rhynie chert. So at the top of those plants, you see little tiny oval-shaped structures. And here we have a fossil of one of those structures, and they show a slice through one of them. And this is the spore-forming organ. If we zoom in further, we can actually see the spores. And there's way more that I could show you, but I only have half an hour. But its material is really fantastic. If we would not have these fossils, we would not really know what was going on in that time interval. Another thing that I want to point out is that a lot of these plants are mainly reproducing vegetatively, so in a way that strawberries do. So they make clonal mats of plants. Going further in time, 200 million years later, during the Middle Devonian, that's when we see the first trees. These trees that still have relatively shallow roots, and they were very odd. On the left side, you see a reconstruction of this plant. They call it a Gilboa tree. It's a relative of ferns of horsetails that I showed you earlier. And in the middle is one of the paleobotanists who studied them, and his name is Bill Stein. And he shows a branch without leaves. These plants were not producing leaves yet. That's also something interesting from that time interval. On the right, you see a 100-year-old picture from when people found these the bases of these Gilboa trees. So they were very, very wide at the bottom. You can see that in the reconstruction as well. And from there, they had some roots going into the soil. This diagram shows more or less what happened during the Silurian and Devonian through time when you look at plant height and rooting depth. So on the left is 440 million years, and on the right is 360 million years ago. And you can see on the left that the initial plants were relatively small, they looked like liverworts, and it takes quite a lot of time until the first Cooksonia shows up. Then plants gradually get bigger, and eventually they start at the end of the Devonian, form relatively deep roots, and produce wood that is similar to that of conifers. That's really when the plants spread out all over the continents, because if you can get wood from deep in the soil, you can live everywhere. So this diagram shows, what I'm now going to talk about, you will show that plants did not only have an effect on the animals that lived in the eventual forest, but that it also had a big effect on the atmosphere and on the soil. These are relatively simple diagrams, but they get the message across. In the upper diagrams, you see the soil and the atmosphere before the Devonian, and the little circles at the top in the white area represent the atmosphere and CO2 in the atmosphere. So during the time before the Devonian, CO2 levels in the atmosphere were relatively high. There was not a lot of life on the continent, so there was not a lot of organic matter that eventually ended up in the soil or living biomass. So in the late Devonian, plants were bigger, and as you know, plants take up CO2 to produce oxygen, but they also store a lot of the CO2 in their bodies to grow. When plants die, some of that organic matter ends up in the soils, and with that, it's also permanently taken out of the atmosphere. So while plants were getting bigger, through the Devonian, we see CO2 levels in the atmosphere going down. But it also has an effect on the water cycle and weathering. So first I'm going to tell you the difference between what we call mechanical weathering and chemical weathering. So mechanical weathering is if you have a rock and wind or water or something else gradually turns it into smaller particles of the same minerals. So smaller just breaks it up in smaller pieces. Chemical weathering actually changes the chemical composition of the particles and also the physical characteristics of the material. I'm not going to show you chemical formulas of that because there are a lot, but that process actually takes up CO2. So that was the part on the difference between the weathering types. If you look at the diagrams, you can see before Devonian and late Devonian again. And those are two landscapes. You can just easily see that water before the Devonian, if it rained, it would rapidly go to the oceans and with it take sediments in the river systems. The soil layers were not very thick, because the sediments were removed all the time. So it was, relatively uniform wealth. When you look at the late Devonian, you see plants there, where you knew that they were coming, so there they are. What you can also see is that the river system changes from braided to meandering. So the river system get more fixed on the surface. The soil, the sediments on land get fixed by the roots, and by that, trap the sediment on land. So this has several consequences, the water change in water cycle and weathering. The physical weathering decreases because it's relatively difficult for instance, wind or water to have an effect on rocks deeper down in the soil. Chemical weathering increases because plants produce acids and other compounds that increase weathering in the soils. Then, because the soil layer is getting deeper, the volume for chemical weathering is also rapidly increases. So the total area on our planet for weathering is much higher. And then you have the carbon that eventually can get stored in the soil because the soil layers are much deeper. So all these things together result in lowering levels of CO2 during the time when plants move onto land. So this diagram shows the atmospheric levels of oxygen and CO2 over the last 600 million years. So on that side, to the right, is the present, and on that side is 600 million years ago. In black is the level of oxygen in the atmosphere, and that's in percent by volume, and the dotted line indicates the oxygen levels that we have right now. In red, you have the amount relative to the current amount of CO2 levels, and you can see that the dotted line that represents that is relatively low. So if you look at it over a time period of CO2 of 600 million years, CO2 levels are relatively low at this moment in time, but it's rapidly increasing. If we now have a look what the effect of plants moving onto land is on these CO2 levels, we can see the following. So this arrow first shows where land plants evolved. This is when they really start to take off. I can just easily see that the red line goes down dramatically. So this decrease in atmospheric CO2 has a big effect on the climate on our planet. Everybody hears over and over that we're increasing our CO2 levels right now and that our planet is warming up. The opposite happened at the end of the Devonian, and we eventually ended up with ice ages, because if you make CO2 levels as low as they were then, you develop an ice cap on the poles of the planet. This is the same situation that we're in now. We're also living in a time where we have 2 ice caps. So this ice age period lasted for about 70 million of years. This diagram is relatively difficult, but I'm going to walk you through it. So just as what we have now, changes in the Earth's orbit cause, during period with ice caps, to fluctuate between warmer periods and colder periods with an ice cap. And we call this glacial interglacial cycle. So glacial is when it was really cold, interglacial when it was slightly warmer. When you have ice caps on the pole, like in the image on the left, that has an effect on the range of what we call the intertropical convergence zone. The intertropical convergence zone is the zone where a lot of rain falls out near the equator. If you have a nice ice cap on the pole, that range gets restricted, and it means that the equator is really, really wet. And that happened during those glacial cycles. You got ever-wet tropics. And if we look at the right side, during the interglacial, the intertropical convergence zones start migrating again with the seasons, and that means that either the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere near the equator gets more water. And that means that it actually gets seasonally dry on the equator. During the periods, during those glacial periods, widespread swamp communities developed in those areas that are in the equator, and that includes our own Europe. So here it's a little bit easier to see which continents formed what parts of this landmass that we call Pangea. All the continents were collided into one big continent, and it more or less forms the letter C. The black lines show over there which part of our planet was covered with the ice caps. And it includes the southern part of South America, Africa, India, Antarctica, still more or less on the same place, and Australia. That's quite a big part of our planet. And in the middle, near the equator, you can see that Europe and America were nicely close together, that France was part of the tropics, and that also parts that formed China, more to the east, were pretty wet. The tropical ever wet is indicated by the dark green color. So if we now take an airplane and go to the late Carboniferous, you would see swamp forests like the ones there on the left, with big lycopods, big horsetails, big ferns, and big seed plants that do not exist anymore. So those swamp forests, we call them peat forests, and we call them peat forests because they produce, in French, tourbe. That is organic material that does not completely break down. And if you just wait for a long time, you get a large packet of that organic material in those swamps. We can still find those swamp layers back. And you probably know what these are. These are coal layers from a mine. Over time, peat from the Carboniferous turned into coal layers. Every time when the sea level went up again during the interglacial cycles, when the ice caps melted, those peatlands were drowned and covered by marine sediments. And then, maybe 100,000 years later, the level dropped again, peats developed again in those peat swamps, and this cycle went on and on and on. So, under the bottom of our feet, there are probably a lot of layers of these Carboniferous coal layers that actually are 300 million year old stored plant carbon. In the mines, like the ones here in the back, you can also see really nice fossils like those giant horsetail plants on the left. So we also know a lot about this time period. So you might already know where I'm heading to. I'm almost done. But we very well know what the use of coal is. We have used it for many centuries to warm our houses and to fuel our factories because they produce a lot of energy. And when you use coal to produce energy or keep your house warm, you release CO2 that was stored by those plants more than 300 million years ago. And with that, those 300 million year old plants are rapidly warming up our planet. So I hope that by the end, I've shown you that plants have changed our atmosphere, our soils, the planet we lived in, a lot. If there weren't plants on the surface of the planet, we would not be here. And even if we would be here, we would have very little to eat. That would come from lands, no vegetables, and also very little to wear. So, in summary, plants changed our planet tremendously. It played a major role in soil formation. It increased chemical weathering and nutrient availability on the surface of our continent, provided food and habitat for all other terrestrial organisms, including us, and they played a crucial role in shaping the Earth's atmosphere and the climate then and now. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for this excellent presentation. So it is kind of a paradox that at the end of the day, it's the plants that are generating the CO2 emission and hence climate change. So have you is your background a geologist?
No, it's plant ecology.
Oh, well, yeah, sorry. As a plant ecologist, maybe if you could think of some geoengineering way or or some way to think about the climate change problem?
Yeah.
Have you ever given it a thought?
Okay, I'll take my translator off, otherwise I hear myself all the time. There are several things that we can do. One of the things is to make what we call our carbon footprint smaller. And that means that if we, for instance, instead of eating a lot of meat from cows and pigs, eat more maybe fish or chicken, or be a vegetarian, that would help. If you fly, try to take the train for short distances, or take direct flights. And if you fly, try to buy carbon offsets so that people somewhere on the planet plant more trees so that more carbon gets taken out of the atmosphere and ends up in the forest again. But if we don't change things relatively fast, then it might be really difficult to change the increase of CO2 in our atmosphere. We do have to get through engineering a way of getting CO2 out of the air. And the limiting factor for that is actually energy. If you have a surplus of energy, for instance, solar energy, if you have way too much of it, then you can get the CO2 out of the air. But we need to get a lot of CO2 out of the air to get back to pre-industrial levels again. But we've done more wild things in the past, so maybe if we all team up, we might be able to do it.